My son announced to 200 people at his company Gala that he built everything himself, that his success came from grit, from discipline, from choosing the right mentors and the right circles. He thanked his business school professors. He thanked his wife's father. He thanked his college roommate who let him sleep on a couch for 3 months. He never said my name. I was sitting at table 14, near the back of the ballroom, next to the emergency exit. The chair beside me was empty. My son had sent me 1 ticket, not 2. I'd asked if I could bring my neighbor Helen, who'd known him since he was 7 years old and used to cut our lawn for spending money. He said the event was limited. I counted 60 empty seats that night. Let me back up, because if I'm going to tell this right, you need to understand who my son was before he became the man in the tailored suit on that stage. My name is Arthur Whitfield. I'm 63 years old. For 26 years I worked as a structural engineer for a mid-size firm out of Columbus, Ohio. Not glamorous work. Not the kind of job that earns you a corner office or a parking spot with your name on it. I drew load calculations. I reviewed permits. I drove a Ford F-150 that I bought used in 2004 and kept running until the transmission gave out in 2018. My wife, Barbara, taught 2nd grade at a public school on the east side of Columbus for 22 years. She made $51,000 a year at her peak. She loved those kids the way some people love their own children. She stayed late on Tuesdays to help students who were falling behind in reading. She bought supplies out of her own pocket every August without complaining. We were not wealthy. But we were not struggling either. We had a house with a mortgage we managed, 2 decent cars, and a savings account that we treated like something sacred. Our son, Philip, was our only child. From the time Philip was 12, he was sharp. Not just book smart, but perceptive in a way that made you feel proud and slightly unnerved at the same time. He could read a room. He noticed things. When I drove into his high school orientation, he scanned the parking lot and told me which cars belonged to the teachers and which belonged to the parents of kids he should get to know. He was 12. I told myself that was ambition. Barbara told herself the same thing. He got into Ohio State on a partial scholarship. The rest, about $18,000 per year, came from us. We refinanced the house to cover it. We didn't tell him. We said we had savings set aside for his education. Technically true. After graduation, he got a job at a financial consultant firm in Chicago, entry level, $58,000 a year. I helped him move. We rented a truck, drove 7 hours, carried boxes up 4 flights of stairs in a Wicker Park walk-up. He told his new co-workers he relocated himself to keep costs down. Entrepreneurial mindset, he called it. Within 3 years, he was promoted. Within 5, he was a senior analyst. He moved to a better apartment in Lincoln Park. He started dating a woman named Sylvia, whose father ran a regional insurance group out of Naperville. I met Sylvia twice before they got engaged. She was polished and pleasant in the way of someone who'd practiced being pleasant since childhood. Barbara died of a stroke in March of 2017. She was 58 years old. She had been healthy, or we thought she was. She collapsed in her classroom on a Tuesday morning. By the time the ambulance arrived, she was already gone. Philip flew home for the funeral. He stayed for 4 days. On the 3rd day, while we were sitting at the kitchen table going through her papers, he told me he had a conference call in 40 minutes that he couldn't reschedule. He took it in the living room with the door closed. I sat at that kitchen table alone and looked at her handwriting on an old grocery list that had been tucked inside a manila folder, and I didn't move for a long time. After Barbara died, I went back to work. What else do you do? I sold the house we'd lived in for 21 years because it was too much space and too many quiet rooms. I bought a small place in Bexley, a 2-bedroom condo with a back porch that got afternoon sun. I put $240,000 in savings from the house sale and let it sit. What Philip didn't know was that selling the house wasn't the only thing I'd done. For 11 years, I'd been a silent partner in a structural consulting firm started by two former colleagues of mine, a man named Ed Gallagher and his wife. They specialized in commercial and industrial contracts, the kind of large-scale work that pays actual money. I had invested $35,000 with them in 2008, right before the market crashed, which was spectacularly bad timing on the surface and turned out to be the best financial decision I ever made, when their biggest competitor folded in 2010. Gallagher's firm absorbed 3 of their largest accounts. By 2015, my silent partnership stake was worth $1.3 million. I kept renewing it. I let the money work. I also held a portfolio of index funds I'd been putting $400 a month into since 1994. Barbara had thought I was too conservative. She preferred individual stocks. We disagreed about this warmly for years. Turns out boring and consistent was not the worst strategy. By 2022, between the partnership distributions, the portfolio, and the proceeds from the house, I had $2.1 million in accessible assets. Philip had no idea. He thought I was retired, living carefully on a pension and Social Security. He once suggested, gently, that I consider downsizing again if the condo maintenance fees became too much. I thanked him for the advice. I kept quiet about the money for the same reason Barbara and I had kept quiet about refinancing the house for his education, because the moment someone knows you have it, the dynamic changes. I'd watched it happen to other families. I didn't want Philip calculating his inheritance. I wanted him to work because he wanted to, not because he was waiting. In 2023, Philip launched his own firm, a boutique financial strategy consultancy based in Chicago. He had 3 employees and 2 anchor clients from his old firm who followed him when he left. He was proud of it in the way that felt earned, and I was proud of him too. Genuinely, I gave him $80,000 to help cover his first year of operating costs. I told him it was from the house sale. He accepted it without asking too many questions and said he'd pay me back when things stabilized. He never did, which was fine. I didn't expect it. That's not why I gave it. The firm grew. By his second year, he had 8 employees and 4 anchor clients and a waiting list. He started speaking at industry events. He developed a website that described him as a first-generation entrepreneur who built his business from the ground up. First generation, I called him once to ask about that phrase. He said it was standard industry language, that it meant he hadn't inherited a family business, which was technically accurate. I said I understood. I let it go. Then his firm was invited to be featured at a gala hosted by the Greater Chicago Business Alliance. It was a big deal. They were profiling 10 emerging businesses in the region. Philip was one of them. He sent me an invitation 4 days before the event. 1 ticket. Black tie. The address was a hotel in the Gold Coast neighborhood I'd never been to. I drove up from Columbus the day before, checked into a Holiday Inn on Michigan Avenue, walked around for a while in the cold, got deep dish pizza alone at a booth by the window. The gala was held in a ballroom that cost more to rent per evening than my first car. Round tables with white tablecloths and low centerpieces and candles everywhere. I was in my best suit, a navy Brooks Brothers. I'd bought for Barbara's work retirement party that never happened. The jacket still fit. I'd lost weight since she died. I found table 14. My table mates were a retired insurance actuary named George and his wife, a couple from Evanston who seemed delightful but kept confusing Philip with someone else, and 2 women from the Alliance's administrative team who were there to manage logistics. Nobody at my table knew who I was. I introduced myself to one of the logistics coordinators. She asked my relation to the evening. I said I was a guest. She looked at a seating chart and moved on. The dinner was served. The speeches began. 4 of the 10 featured entrepreneurs spoke before Philip. They were all younger than him and all impressive in their own ways. One had built a solar installation company from a trailer in her parents' driveway. Another had developed a logistics app that rerouted supply chains during the port backups of 2021. I respected what they'd done. Then Philip took the stage. He looked good. He'd always looked good, that was never the issue. Tall, confident. The kind of person who fills a room without seeming to try. He thanked the Alliance. He thanked the other honorees. He said something gracious about the city of Chicago. Then he started telling his story. He talked about the early years at the consulting firm and how much he'd learned from the pressure. He talked about the fear of leaving stability to go out on his own. He talked about the moment he decided to bet on himself. These were all real things that happened. I know, because he called me during some of those moments, late at night, uncertain, and I talked him through it. He didn't mention that. He talked about his wife Sylvia's support, which was real and deserved acknowledgement. He thanked her father, a man named Gerald Harmon, for his early advice on structuring client retainers. He thanked two of his former colleagues by name. He thanked his business school professor. Then he said it. He said, "I didn't come from money. I didn't have a safety net. Everything I built myself. Starting from zero." I put my fork down. Starting from zero. I sat with that for a moment. Thought about the refinanced house. Thought about the $80,000. Thought about the nights Barbara graded papers at the kitchen table so we could put money into a savings account that would eventually pay for his tuition. Thought about the moving truck, and the 4 flights of stairs and the 7-hour drive home alone after I dropped him off. Thought about the night Barbara died, and the conference call behind the closed door. I didn't feel angry exactly. Anger is too simple for what I felt. It was more like a door closing somewhere inside me, quietly with a soft click. The room applauded. Philip smiled. Gerald Harmon, his father-in-law, who was seated at the head table, raised his glass. I sat at table 14 and looked at my son standing in that light. And I thought about what Barbara had said to me 3 weeks before she died. We'd been sitting on the back porch. It was one of those late winter evenings that surprises you by being warmer than it should be. She had a glass of iced tea. She said, "Arthur, at some point you're going to have to let Philip know who you actually are, not who he's decided you are." I asked her what she meant. She looked at me the way she looked at her students when they already knew the answer and were just waiting to be asked the right question. "He thinks you're smaller than you are," she said, "and you keep letting him." I hadn't known what to do with that then. I'd put it away the way I put difficult things away and left it there. After the gala concluded and the honorees were posing for photos, I walked to the stage area. Philip saw me coming, and his expression did something complicated. There was warmth in it, and underneath the warmth, something else, something that looked like he was calculating how to introduce me. He said, "Dad, glad you made it." Then he turned to Gerald Harmon and said, "Gerald, this is my father, Arthur. He lives in Columbus. He lives in Columbus. He lives in Columbus." That was my introduction. A city. Gerald Harmon shook my hand. He was a broad man with a firm grip and the kind of confidence that comes from having never been seriously wrong about anything. He said, "Arthur, you must be very proud. Your son has done something remarkable entirely on his own terms." I looked at Gerald Harmon. I looked at Philip. Philip was watching me with something careful in his eyes. Not quite a warning. More like a hope that I would agree with Gerald and leave it at that. And I almost did. I spent 40 years being the man who left things at that. The man who didn't need credit. Who was proud to work quietly. Who believed that the doing was more important than the being seen to do. Barbara had loved that about me, and worried about it in equal measure. I thought about what she'd said on the porch. "Actually," I said, "I'd like to share something, if you'll give me a minute." Philip's face shifted. "Dad, this isn't really It'll be brief," I said. "I promise." The Alliance coordinator was standing nearby, and Philip, caught between two instincts, looked at her. She gestured toward a small podium at the edge of the stage area, where the honorees had been taking photos. She said guests were welcome to add remarks. I walked to the podium. I don't know how to explain what it felt like to stand at that microphone. I'm not a public speaker. I've given 2 toasts in my life, both at retirement dinners, and I read from index cards both times. But I wasn't nervous. I don't know why. Maybe because I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I was just going to tell the truth. I said, "Good evening. My name is Arthur Whitfield. I'm Philip's father. I drove up from Columbus today, which, for the record, is 7 hours round trip, so I want to make sure this is worth the mileage." A few people laughed. Philip gave a beautiful speech tonight about building something from nothing, about betting on himself. I'm proud of him for that. He's worked hard. But I want to offer a small amendment to the record, because I think accuracy matters in a room full of people who work in finance. I paused, not for effect, just because I needed a breath. In 2005, my wife Barbara and I refinanced our home to fund Philip's college education. That was $72,000 over 4 years. We didn't tell him where the money came from because we didn't want him to feel the weight of it. We wanted him to focus. The room was quieter than it had been all night. In 2010, when Philip moved to Chicago, I drove a rental truck 7 hours, helped him carry boxes up 4 flights of stairs, and drove 7 hours home. Alone. Because that's what fathers do. I looked at Philip. He wasn't looking back at me. He was looking at the floor. In 2023, when he launched his firm, I gave him $80,000 to cover first-year operating costs. He said he'd pay it back. I never expected him to. That's also what fathers do. I reached into my jacket pocket and took out 2 folded papers. I had brought them from Columbus. I'd been carrying them in my car for 3 weeks, ever since I received the Gala invitation. Not because I planned to use them exactly. More because Barbara's voice on the porch had been getting louder. "This," I said, holding up the first paper, "is a statement from my financial advisor. My current liquid assets total just over $2 million. Not from an inheritance. Not from a business my father built. From 26 years of careful work, a long-term investment in a small engineering firm, and putting $400 a month into index funds every month since 1994. I let that settle, and this," I held up the second paper, "is a letter from my estate attorney confirming a decision I finalized last Tuesday. I've established a scholarship fund at Barbara's school, the school where she taught 2nd grade for 22 years. The fund is called the Barbara Whitfield Reading Initiative. It will pay for classroom supplies, tutoring materials, and summer reading programs for as long as it's funded. I've seeded it with $600,000. I folded the papers and put them back in my pocket. Philip built something real. He should be proud of it. But he didn't start from zero. None of us start from zero. We start from the people who loved us before we knew what love cost. I stepped back from the podium. The room was very quiet for a moment. Then someone at a table near the front began to clap. Slowly at first, then others joined. Not the whole room. But enough. I walked back toward table 14. Philip was still at the edge of the stage when I passed him. His expression was the most unguarded I'd seen on his face since he was a boy. He looked for just a moment, like the 12-year-old in the passenger seat of my truck reading the parking lot. He said, "Dad." I said, "I love you, Philip. I have loved you every day of your life. But you stood at that microphone and erased your mother." He didn't answer. I didn't wait for one. I got my coat from the coat check and walked outside into the January cold. A valet asked if I needed my car. I said I'd walked. He looked skeptical, given the temperature. I walked anyway. I needed the air. By the time I got back to the Holiday Inn, my phone had 2 missed calls from Philip and 1 text that said, "We need to talk. Please don't leave." I sat on the edge of the hotel bed in my good suit, looking at Barbara's face on my phone's lock screen. It's a photo from a camping trip we took in 2011. She's laughing at something off camera. I can't remember what. I called him back. He answered before the first ring finished. Dad. His voice was different. Thinner. I didn't mean for it to come across that way. I was talking about the business, just the business. I know, I said. Starting from zero meant starting the company from zero. Not, Philip. He stopped. Your mother taught second grade for 22 years, I said. She bought classroom supplies with her own money. She refinanced our home so you could go to college and never once asked for anything in return. She died in that classroom on a Tuesday morning. And tonight you stood in front of 200 people and thanked everyone except her. A long silence. I didn't know about the refinancing, he said quietly. No, you weren't supposed to. Or the $80,000. You knew about that. I thought it was. I thought you had savings from the house. I did, and I chose to give it to you. Another silence. I could hear him breathing. I've been telling that story about starting from nothing for 2 years, he said, at every speaking event, on the website, in the pitch decks. I know, and I believed it. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. That's the part I can't. I actually believed it. I thought about what Barbara said on the porch. He thinks you're smaller than you are, and you keep letting him. That's on me too, I said. I let you believe a smaller version of me because I thought it was humble. But there's a difference between humble and invisible. We talked for another hour. Not about the money. About Barbara mostly. About things he remembered and things I remembered that he hadn't seen. About the grocery lists and the Tuesday tutoring sessions and the camping trip where she laughed at something off camera. By the end of it, he was crying. I hadn't heard him cry since he was a teenager. He asked what he could do. I told him the website needed to be updated, that his story was still a good story, still one worth telling, but it was missing 2 people who deserved to be in it. I told him that acknowledging help was not weakness. I told him that the most capable people I'd ever worked with in 26 years of engineering were the ones who knew exactly which load they were bearing alone and which loads had been shared. He asked about the scholarship fund. I told him about the Barbara Whitfield Reading Initiative, that I'd funded it last Tuesday, that it would run for as long as it was funded, and that I intended to fund it for a long time. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Can I contribute to it?" I said yes. I drove back to Columbus the next morning. 7 hours. I stopped at a diner in Mansfield for coffee and eggs. The waitress had a name tag that said, Donna, and she refilled my coffee 3 times without being asked, which I always think is the mark of a good person. I thought about Barbara the whole drive home. I thought about the conversation on the porch and the camping trip and the second grade classroom on the east side of Columbus where she had taught for 22 years, buying supplies out of her own pocket every August. I thought about the ways we teach people who we are and the ways we allow ourselves to be misread. 6 months later, the Barbara Whitfield Reading Initiative held its first event at the school. They'd set up tables in the gymnasium with books and school supplies. Local businesses donated backpacks. The principal gave a short speech about what Barbara had meant to the school community. Philip came. He drove from Chicago. He brought Sylvia. He brought a check for $25,000. He didn't announce it. He handed it quietly to the principal before the event started. I stood in the back of that gymnasium and watched my son stack books on a table with the same hands that had written first-generation entrepreneur on his website. He was talking to a second-grade teacher about reading comprehension. He was smiling, not the polished Gala smile, but the other one, the real one. I don't know if Philip became a different person that night at the gala. I don't know if I said the right things or if there was a right thing to say. What I know is that Barbara was right, the way she usually was. There's a difference between staying quiet because you're humble and staying quiet because you've started to believe the smaller story yourself. The scholarship fund grows every year. The school sends me quarterly updates with photos and names. Children I'll never meet, reading books in a room that Barbara would have recognized. Her name is on the wall outside the library now, a small plaque. Nothing grand, just her name and the years she taught there. I drive by it sometimes when I'm in that part of town. I don't need to stop. I know it's there. That's enough. I've thought a lot about why I stayed quiet for so long. Not just about the money, but about all of it. Who I was, what I'd built. The choices Barbara and I made together for 20-some years without ever asking for recognition. I used to think that silence was a form of dignity, that needing to be seen was vanity, and vanity was weakness. I was wrong about that. Not completely, but enough. There's a version of humility that's real and worth keeping. You do the work because the work matters, not because someone's watching. You give because you have something to give, not because you want credit on a balance sheet. I still believe that. But I learned the hard way that there's another kind of silence that has nothing to do with humility. It's the silence that lets someone rewrite history because you were too proud to correct them. And that kind of silence doesn't protect anyone. It just leaves the record wrong. Philip didn't become someone who erased his mother because he was cruel. He became that person because I let him build a story with missing pieces, and I never handed him the rest of the pages. That's on me as much as it's on him. We teach people how to see us, and for years, I taught my son to see a smaller version of his father, a man who drove an old truck and lived carefully and didn't amount to much by the measures he'd started to care about. He filled in the blanks with what made sense given what I'd shown him. I can't be entirely surprised by what he concluded. What I know now, standing on the other side of that night in Chicago, is that the choices we make quietly still shape the people around us. Barbara bought classroom supplies out of her own pocket for 22 years. She never mentioned it at dinner. She never asked for a plaque or a thank you card or a line in anyone's speech. She did it because those kids needed pencils and she had the money, and that was that. But those choices accumulated into something. They accumulated into a woman who was worth remembering, worth naming a scholarship after, worth driving 7 hours round trip to honor. The cause and the effect are always connected, even when you can't see the thread. The refinanced house produced a college education. The college education produced a career. The career produced a man who stood on a stage in a Gold Coast ballroom and said he started from zero. And then an old engineer from Columbus stood at a different microphone and told the truth, because a woman he loved had once told him there was a difference between being humble and being invisible, and she'd been right. I don't know if Philip will tell his story differently from here on. I hope so. I know he came to the gymnasium that Saturday with a check he handed quietly to the principal before the event started. He stacked books on a table and talked to a second-grade teacher about reading comprehension, and he smiled, the real smile, not the Gala one. That meant something to me. I'm not going to pretend it fixed everything, because life doesn't work in clean fixes, but it was a beginning that looked like something Barbara would have recognized. What I'd say to anyone listening is this: the truth you carry quietly still has weight. It shapes what the people around you believe about themselves, about you, about what's possible. You don't have to announce everything, but you do have to decide, eventually, whether your silence is serving something worth protecting or just letting the wrong story stand. Barbara knew. She said it on that back porch with her iced tea, and I put it away like I put difficult things away, and I left it there for years. The lesson I take from all of it isn't about money. It's about that porch. About listening to the people who love you when they tell you who you actually are, and about finding the courage, even late, even imperfectly, to stand at the microphone and say it yourself.